I gotta be honest with you, no rumination I can do on this game will be sufficient to get it across. It's kind of the same boat I was in with some other games that have an absolutely massive backstory and setting and politics and cultures and different mentalities and many different characters. These large breadth games, I can't actually do them justice. It's not physically possible for me to sit here and talk about it one by one going down the list. That's more lore run material than rumination material. Not that I'm saying I would agree to a lore run of Arcanum. I'm not. I'm just telling you. Arcanum, some people consider Arcanum to be the last of that particular era's CRPGs. Now, to define what I mean by that, CRPG, if I'm not mistaken, literally just means computer RPG, but it's a term I've heard many times used to describe this type of game. D&D style, usually turn-based, sometimes active time-based, isometric view, large world, all paths lead to Rome, game design philosophy, heavily focused on RPG mechanics. You get to choose your own dialogue. You play a character that you design rather than a pre-existing character. All that kind of stuff. All of those things that define, like, Fallout or Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale. All of these fall into the same category. Now, to be clear, I don't fully agree with that assessment, and it's Lord knows that there have been CRPGs that have come out since then. There's the Neverwinter Nights series, of course, but far more recently, there's Divinity Original Sin 2 isn't out yet. Sorry, Divinity Original Sin 1, Pillars of Eternity, and Pillars of Eternity 2, which is also not out yet. Tyranny, the recent Torment game that just came out, all that stuff. So certainly they have had a resurgence lately, and many people attribute that to Pillars of Eternity. And I bring that up because a lot of the same people who worked on Arcanum, which I'm going to call Arcanum from now on, by the way, because I really have trouble saying Arcanum of Steamworks and Magick Obscura for some reason. So, Arcanum is many people have considered Pillars of Eternity to be Arcanum 2. And if you really sit back and look at the underpinnings of both settings, it's not actually, like, it fits better than you'd think it would. I'm not saying they literally are, of course, because the rights to the Arcanum setting, if I'm not mistaken, are under the Activision label now and will probably never be used again, which is a shame because there actually was going to be an Arcanum 2. They were making it with the, I can't think of the name of the engine. It's the Half-Life engine, and they had this whole thing they were pushing for it, but then some rights issues got in the way, and then some more rights issues got in the way, and then Troika dissolved. So that was the end of that. What are you going to do, right? Now, I mentioned this game, though. Actually, before I go any further, I want to tell you a bit of a story that I found rather amusing. This game crashed my monitor. Now, I want to be clear. I don't mean it made my monitor wig out. That's actually usually a graphics card issue on your computer. No, it crashed my monitor to the point where I had to not only hard reboot my monitor, which didn't fix it, same issue. I can't even visually describe or audibly describe what was happening visually on my monitor. It was the weirdest looking thing. But then I had to hard reboot my monitor, then hook my monitor up through HDMI to my PS4 in order to have just another connection so that it could use that to figure out what it should be doing, do another reboot with the PS4 connection, then shut it off all the way down again, reconnect it to the computer, and then my monitor start working again. So just a bit of a warning, make sure you have that unofficial patch and the windowed mode shortcut set up if you want to play this game. I wanted to start with that because the very next thing I want to talk about is how much I recommend you play this game. You can buy it on Good Old Games right now. The GOG version works just fine. Get that unofficial patch, though, and make the shortcut with dash window after the quotes and shortcut. Just make sure you do that so it doesn't do to you what it did to me. God, that freaked me out. I thought I'd lost my very expensive, very nice monitor. But just do that. It is definitely worth the price of admission, even now. And I mentioned that because playing this game right after playing Fallout 2 was just whiplash for me. If I had realized this, I probably would have set this game after Planescape Torment. In fact, now that I'm saying this out loud, maybe I should reschedule this and actually have this go live after the Torment video. But that wouldn't change anything because now I can't tell you about it. So whatever. Because next week we'll be looking at Torment. Planescape Torment, or Torment Planescape. I can never remember how you're supposed to say it. It's the first one, the old one. But of all of those older games, I have said this for years, that they just have not aged well for me, and that I have so much difficulty going back to them. You know, going back to the Baldur's Gates, going back to the Icewind Dales, going back to the Fallouts, going back to the original Wasteland game, you know, going back to Planescape Torment and going back to Arcanum. I've always said I have difficulty going back because of the UI and because of how many difficulties. I gave a whole speech about that in Fallout 2, right? I didn't have any problems going back to this one. Like, there were a couple of issues, but they were issues that was like, oh, okay, well, I just have to do this. Like, probably the biggest irritation for me was, and the biggest thing that I had to get readjusted to, is the fact that the game doesn't pause when you do things. Like, if you go into your inventory or you go into the map or whatever, there's this little bubble in the upper left that's showing what's happening around your character live while you're doing your thing. And of course, in order to exit those menus to get back to your normal view, you have to click that bubble, which isn't exactly intuitive. But, like, that's about it as far as my complaints when it comes to the UI. The UI actually made sense for the most part and involved relatively few clicks, and was something that, you know, didn't aggravate me constantly playing through it. Now, in the interests of total honesty, I should mention that back in the day, I replayed Arcanum a lot. I played this game a lot. In fact, this game came to my attention through the demo. I actually figure anybody around my age group probably knows what I'm talking about, because a demo of Arcanum came out, and it's like the first town. You know, the blimp crash, and you get to the town, and pretty much all of the quests in that town, with like one or two exceptions, are there, leading to the culmination of you dealing with the bandits at the bridge, and then Mr. Radcliffe on the other side of the bridge, and then demo over. It was a fairly large, fairly substantial demo that as soon as I had finished playing, I immediately restarted and played through again. And again. The game hooked me because of its... I don't know how to phrase it. The premise interested me, which is funny because I'll be saying stuff about the premise later. The premise of a setting in which magic and tech exist alongside each other, but can't really. You know, magic disrupting tech and tech disrupting magic, or absorbing magic, actually, depending on how you define that. And the idea of, they literally, this is what I call a slight variance nowadays. At the time, I didn't have a term for this, but nowadays I call this a slight variance concept. Take something very well established, something you know very much about, change one thing very precisely that will have a huge ripple effect on everything else, and then do a story or a game or a whatever, analyzing what has happened and discussing and moving forward with what has happened as a result of that slight variance. And that's exactly what we have here, because this is, in basically every way, a completely typical medieval fantasy Tolkien-style setting, except for the fact that they happen to be about midway / and on the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. That's the slight variance, and that fascinated the hell out of me. Ignoring the obvious, you know, dwarves with guns. Bonus points if you know what I'm talking about. Ignoring the obvious appeal factor of the steampunk plus fantasy concept, which I do like, cough, cough, Final Fantasy VI, cough, cough, but I loved that idea of, because so many fantasy settings don't do that. Most fantasy settings exist in a kind of technological, or excuse me, progressional stasis. Now, in some cases, it's explained. In some cases, they actually discuss and analyze why it is that they're in this kind of stasis. And this is a weird example to bring up, but Harry Potter is not actually a bad example of this. Because in Harry Potter, it's mentioned they have access to all this magic, so they don't bother to progress. Not just technologically, but societally and culturally as well. What we've got now works just fine. Why would we change it? So, and this is something that some other fantasy settings have done as well. Have a reason for why they're just sitting there in this medieval stasis. Not every setting explains that, though. In fact, I would say it's the exceptions that bother to explain it. But I love the idea of rather than explaining it, just have there be no stasis. Have them move forward. Have them actually advance. What would happen in Lord of the Rings if they discovered steam engines, for example? Just to name one possibility there. The other thing that really made this game stand out for me, though, was it was very, very believable. A huge amount of effort and polish was put into this game, and it shows. It's such a damn shame. This is not one of the more well-known games of its particular genre or of its particular era. I mean, if you ask a CRPG fan about Arcanum, they probably know about it. But if you ask an RPG fan, which is a much huger audience, the odds go much smaller if they've actually even heard of this game, and even smaller if they've actually played it. And I want to say this one more time. I know it's kind of an older game, but I do honestly recommend you pick this one up and give it a try. It is worth at least one playthrough, because it, in my opinion, is the pinnacle embodiment of what a CRPG should be. That being said, I can't say there's no flaws in it. but let me rewind just a bit before I get to the flaws. Let's talk about that polish. Obviously, this is a fairly gritty setting, but unlike some gritty settings, there are many possibilities of making it better. In fact, there is a so-called golden ending to Arcanum, where you go through and basically do everything right in order to make sure that everywhere prospers and everyone does better. And you could basically lead to a new golden era for Arcanum, which is the name of the place they're on. And, literal geological location. And I like that. I like the fact that despite how dark and depressing and horrible this place is, you can improve it. You can also make it worse. But it's so believable. I don't know how else to phrase that. It is so wonderfully believable. I could actually see a place like Arcanum really existing. That's the definition. It's not realistic. It's believable. It's something that they've sold me on it. There's no whacked out weirdness, with two exceptions I'll talk about later. And most of the characters feel very, very down to earth. The funny thing is, Arcanum is also simultaneously a very low-tier setting and a very high-tier setting. An individual mage destroyed an entire nation in this setting. That's pretty high-tier. And yet it goes out of its way to make the majority of the setting very, very low-tier. It's what I kind of think of as the Eberron effect, a.k.a. percentage-wise, like 99% of the setting is low-tier, and then the outlier 1% is very high-tier. And that kind of fits this rather well. But let's talk about those flaws. First of all, this game is very unforgiving. It does have a journal, but it's basically the Morrowind style, a.k.a. it'll jot down notes, and I hope you remember where those things are and where those names are and so forth and so on. You also have to kind of find your own locations on the overworld map, with a few exceptions. I do like the way they use the overworld map, by the way, if I could just diverge for a second. The usage of fast travel is nice. The usage of actual coordinates, so you can actually find locations, is nice. Also, one thing, they kind of went Daggerfall-y here. They use a little algorithm thing, which I'm not going to actually go into. I'm just going to call it an algorithm thing. I talked about it on the stream, where for example, if you leave the crash site, you can actually walk to Shrouded Hills. Just walk there. You'll be walking across completely typeless terrain and probably not even any encounter, so it's basically empty mass. But you can do it if you want to. I'm not sure why they did that. I think it was kind of an in-between step between, say, Fallout 2, which had, nothing. Like, there was no actual overworld. There was just the map and then encounter bubbles, encounter cells you could get into. So it was like a halfway between that and something like, say, Morrowind, where the whole world is there and manually crafted. Like a step-up kind of a thing. Or an in-between kind of a thing. But either way, so you've got the overworld, and you can travel through it, interact with people. There is fast travel. There's... Let me put it to you this way. If you're looking at that overworld map, and you're like, oh, well, there's like a location that's like right here. One pixel on that overworld map is actually larger than it looks like, because it's fairly large, this continent you're on. And so, for example, if you're trying to go to some place that you can't actually warp to, that there's no overworld map bubble to click on for fast travel, and there are a couple places like that, good luck actually finding it. But they have the coordinates, they have the overworld map. They have the option of being real-time versus turn-based. By the way, if you're first playing for this game, I very strongly recommend you do turn-based. The game is designed through balancing to be played in turn-based. If you play it in real-time, your enemies will effectively be going faster than you because they're unhinged. They can just take actions infinitely and freely, and they will. And they will kick you to death, and it will be quite brutal. I know that sounds like a joke, but I'm serious. It's actually kind of brutal if they knock you out and then just beat you to death by kicking you and surrounding you. It's kind of horrible. They also have the click to move to target thing. I know this is a very minor thing to comment on, but for example, in most earlier games, you can't like click an enemy and have the character smartly pathfind to the enemy and then start attacking. You have to pathfind yourself, then click the enemy separately, and if you happen to be too far or too close, then you have to manually adjust that. So just little convenience features. Like I said, the design philosophy moving closer to the modern age. But I was talking about flaws. I mentioned this game is unforgiving. Even on the easiest difficulty... Does this game have difficulty? I actually don't remember all of a sudden. I didn't mess with it this playthrough. Anyways, even on if there is an easiest difficulty... I don't think I've ever messed with that. The game, it is easier than you'd think to die within minutes of playing this game. There's also a lot of not holding your hand throughout the game. Just to name two examples that right off the top of my head. If you hold on to a camera that you find from the blimp crash, you can get very much rewarded for that. You can also find a little, if you find the airplane thing that the ogre was flying, you can get a necklace off of him. Now, it's not the only time you can get that necklace, but if you do get that necklace, it's very valuable, 15 to 20 hours from now. I'm not even kidding about that. But that's not quite what I mean. The game doesn't give you any hints. This is a game that I would strongly recommend you have a notebook alongside you and take your own damn notes, because the game certainly isn't going to help you with that, not really. But what I really mean is the combat. Now, the problem here is that this is one of those games, like many other CRPGs of its era, that gives you an absolutely gargantuan amount of customization options. In fact, I would say this is one of the best leveling systems I've ever seen. Not the best, that'd be Ashron's call, but one of the best. It works very simply. Every level you gain, you get points. You can put those points anywhere. To increase your base stats, to increase your health, to increase your vitality, to increase your proficiency in skills, to increase your proficiency in specific schools of magic, or to increase your knowledge with technology. You can put those points anywhere. That's it. That's the leveling system. It's very basic, and it's very modular. But it is immeasurably easy, if you don't know what you're doing, to build yourself into a corner. And I mean early on, too. We're talking like you can die within the first few hours of this game if you build yourself into something that you can't do. In fact, that leads me to the next point I was going to talk about. So I mentioned combat, right? I was actually watching a gentleman, this was years ago. This was a friend of mine who I'd introduced to Arcanum. So he gets out of the blimp crash, and he's like, all right, goes, fights some wolves, fast travels, goes and goes into the steam engine place where there's those rats, right? And he died. For reference, that was his second combat encounter in the game that he died at, with Virgil backing him up and healing. If this game, more than any of the other CRPGs, really could use a proper remake, in my opinion. And my reason for saying that isn't, that sounds contradictory, because in my opinion this game has aged much better than the other ones. But what this game needs is a balance pass. There are many skills that are very underpowered, and there are some skills that are very overpowered. And figuring out which is which, like if you don't have a guide or you don't know the game, figuring out which is going to be a hell of a problem. I'd say it's the FF5 effect, but it actually isn't, because it is actually possible to build yourself in a way that you are just weaker than you should be. And the level cap is 50. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wow, oh no, 50 level cap. No, trust me, that is very small. It is very easy to hit that level cap before you even get halfway through this game. That's ignoring the portal trick, by the way, which you can get, on average, about 20 to 30 levels off of. So completely ignoring that, it's very, very easy to hit the level cap early on, and you only have so many points, and there's no respecking. So this is one of those, you want to have your build all planned out and ready to go kind of games, and you don't want to experiment and try new things unless you're doing a challenge run. In other words, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's playing this game for the first time. Let me go ahead and give you a bit of a hint. If you are playing this game for the first time, play a mage. Just trust me, play a mage. Mages are stronger earlier on and stronger later on, if you build them right, than you're going to be if you go full tech or just full melee or something else like that. Now, there are some things you can do to break the game, but only if you know exactly what you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of tip. Look up, if you want to play this game and you want to be a technology person, look up Pyrotechnic Axe. Just Google it, Pyrotechnic Axe Arcanum. And I'm not going to go through the whole tidbit here. I've known about that trick forever. My friend Vincent, forever ago, actually introduced me to that trick. And you can get it as pretty much as soon as you hit Toronto, which is basically the second town. And it's actually easier than it sounds to do, as long as you know exactly where to go and exactly who to talk to and exactly how to do it. And get lucky, because there's also some RNG involved in being able to purchase some of the items you need to make that. But if you do make that, it's one of the best melee weapons of the game that doesn't have durability, doesn't break. So, stuff like that. This game needs a balance pass. It is actually harder than it should be. By which I mean it is artificially hard, just because so many things are weaker, and so many things require you to know exactly how to use the things that are good, versus not knowing what you're doing and trying to experiment. And in my opinion, if you have such a massive variety, huge number of spells, huge number of items you can build, huge different ways you can design your character, like 30 freaking backgrounds that can have significant effect on your combat style. If you're going to have that level of malleability, you need to at least have them be kind of close to balanced with each other. You need to make it so the player can experiment and not be punished for doing so. And that's what I mean by the artificial difficulty, because it's actually punishing to build the wrong build in this game. Another thing this game does, this is just mentioning it, but I made a note about it, so I'm going to talk about it. Who knows about the bear trick? So, I only mention this because there's a challenge run for Arcanum called the Technical Pacifist, which means you never directly kill anybody, and it's actually pretty easy to do. A true pacifist run is very difficult to do, because you got to know exactly how to get through that. But a Technical Pacifist, no, that's a joke. There's a spell you can get, which is basically Tame Animal. Let's say there's some guy who has something you want. Well, that's no problem. I'm going to go ahead and tame this bear. Wander into his house. Say hi. Wander out. Get the bear in there. Close the door behind me so the bear can't get out. Remove the tame from the bear. What do you think happens? There's a lot of things you can do like that. It reminds me in many ways of Fallout 2's thing with the super stims, where you can give someone many super stims and then they die of health overdose, basically. But I mention that because in addition to being able to not directly kill people, in addition to being able to kill people directly, in addition to being able to shoot people, in addition to being able to magic people, and in addition to being able to talk people down, there's usually an option to basically bypass several specific quests or several key encounters simply by knowing the right information and being able to interact with and coordinate with someone else and saying, hey, I talked to this other guy, and that opened a new dialogue option for me, so you should back off now. Oh, God, you're right, I'm sorry. Just to name, it's the freedom thing. It's that all roads lead to Rome design philosophy again. Because this game is aggressively linear when it comes to the main quest. But the main quest is you've woken up from a blimp, then you go to the void and you fight the last boss. No spoilers in there. I'm not saying anything else, although I will be spoiling the hell out of this game later on. But I haven't really spoiled anything yet. I mentioned that because that is the main quest. Yeah, there's a bunch of breadcrumb trails in between point A and point B, but you can ignore literally all of them. Everything else is up to you. How do you do it? My favorite example of this is in the very first town. Oh my God, there's going to be a bank robbery. Or actually, I'm trying to remember how you can do it. Maybe no, it's not the bank robbery. It's there's actually another. There's a quest to do a bank robbery and a quest to stop a bank robbery. But I'm actually thinking of another one. I can't remember how it goes. It's like basically there's these two people who don't like each other, and one of them wants to kill the other, and one of them wants to steal from the other. So you do the steal from the other quest first, and then you do the kill the other quest second, and then you have actually managed to accomplish both. And there's multiple ways around that too, and blah blah blah. There is an alignment meter, a good versus evil thing as well in this game, which whatever. Also, there's a lot of companions in this game, which, unless you have a guide, you're probably not going to encounter, like, any of them. I mean, Magnus is the only companion you run into in the main quest that I recall off the top of my head. Well, I guess there's Raven, too, but most people don't even know you can recruit her. At least when I was playing this game back in the day, most people didn't know that. So now, the spoiler gloves are off. Let's go ahead and talk about the story of this game, because I've just been talking about gameplay. Y'all complained about Persona 4. Here, have some gameplay. Let's talk about the player character, because this is probably one of my favorite examples. Now, I'm going to be spoiling stuff right off the bat, okay? Just want to make that clear. So if you still haven't played this game and you'd like to play it on spoiler, just shut off the video, go buy it on Good Old Games, come back to me in like 3 months when you've beat the game. So, you have been warned. Now, one of my favorite aspects of the fact is that this game, it likes to play with tropes. It likes to play with the expected. It likes to mask things with the obvious. So you start off, and there's Virgil, who's right there, and you have survived this crash, and there's this prophecy regarding you. You are the destined one, the reincarnation of Nasruddin. I can never remember his name. He's the only one of the three I can never remember his name. You are the reincarnation of Nasruddin. You are truly the greatest one of all, and blah, 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 right? And so you are the chosen, destined one. And Virgil says, I will be with you. By the way, you really want Virgil to be with you. You don't want to be playing this game solo. Virgil's also probably one of my favorite characters. In fact, I only have notes as far as the party members on him and Magnus. So that gives you an idea there. Anyways, so the reason I like this is because at first it's like, okay, I'm part of some destined chosen one. I am the reincarnation of Nasruddin. Got it. So I will rise up to the challenge and do all this stuff. Here's the thing that I like about this. And really very, very, very few stories do this. I like someone rising to the occasion and becoming a hero through their actions, but I also like there being an explanation for how they can match people stronger than them. And very, very few fictional works actually accomplish both at the same time. Usually, they accomplish one or the other. FF5, I hate to bring that up again, is actually one of a very few number of games where they kind of have a little bit of both. But, in FF5, for example, we're normal, ordinary people. We're no one special, but because we are empowered by the crystals, we are now capable of standing up to beings and creatures who are far stronger than us. That's what I mean by giving an explanation, giving an in-lore explanation for why we are capable of being stronger and more capable of fighting these things that are above our pay grade, right? Well, in this game, you have a reason for that, because you are this destined, great, chosen hero. And you must rise up, and you have all this knowledge, and you must strive forward, and this prophecy emboldens you, and it's fake. The prophecy is fake. But it did provide the why. Because you were told from the beginning that you were this great destined individual, you rose to the occasion. Which brings me to the second point. Someone who is small becoming someone who is big simply through persistence of action. The Wind Waker effect, if you will. The fact that they are able to be just a nobody, and through their own persistence and through their own action and through their own desire to rise to this call, became a hero. There was no actual destiny. There was no real prophecy. It was all just malarkey. You're not the reincarnation of Nasruddin. It's kind of hard to be reincarnated from some guy who's still alive. It's funny when you meet him, actually. So, yeah, I like how it approaches that. I like that design towards a hero. And again, very, very, very few fictional works, especially games, tend to take that approach toward it. Most games which have you as a nobody who rises up through the ranks usually do it pretty much just because there's no explanation given for how you're able to become so powerful. To be blunt, the Fallouts are actually a good example of that. You know, pretty much all of the Fallout main characters are the guy, or the girl as the case may be, of their particular setting, you know, top tier, right? And yet there's really very rarely an actual explanation for why that is. In fact, the only game that's ever actually bothered to have any kind of explanation for that is Fallout 4 of all games, where the man, if you're playing the male character, actually was ex-military and therefore would have the training and knowledge and skill to be this deadly badass in the wasteland. You know, there's no explanation for it. So I like that this explanation is here as this empowering thing, because it's all a morale thing. It gave you the impetus to say, maybe I can do great things. And then you try to do great things, and you accomplish them through persistence and through action. This is also a good time to mention that you can be evil in this game. No, you don't actually understand what I mean by that. Most of the time when you can be evil in a game, what you can actually be is destructive in a game. And I try to be specific about my terminology here, but I sometimes fail. You can usually be like, ah ha ha, kill, kill, kill. And yeah, you can kill a lot of NPCs, and you can be like, ah ha ha, you know, just being just a jerk, basically. But no, you can actually be evil in this game. I'm not going to give you many examples because they're kind of messed up. But my favorite example is really simple. See, in this game, there's no essential NPCs, but you need to be able to move forward in the plot anyway, right? Well, there's a spell that you have access to where you can rip the souls of the dead back from their corpses and torture them for information to find out where you need to go or what the next quest hook is. And usually, like 9 times out of 10, those NPCs will drop some kind of key item or a literal key on their person that enables you to get to the next spot in the chain. And this is not just for the main quest, this is for side quests. You can just murder your way through this game if you want to. Yes, even Nazradin, the guy who sends you to the Void. Because as soon as you kill him, in fact, that's the speedrunner's track, it's the fastest way to get to the Void. You can't convince him to send you to the Void unless you have the Vendragoth device. So let's talk about Virgil. Virgil's awesome. I do like Virgil a lot. Very well voice acted. Great voice acting in general in this game, of course. But what I like about him is he is probably the most default example of the obvious, non-obvious thing. Because he looks like a one-note character at first. He looks like I had a troubled past and then I found religion type of character. And that's like all there is to him, right? But as you go through the game, and I'm not going to give away every little tidbit on Virgil, but as you go through the game, you start to learn there's more nuance to him. There's more subtlety and shadings to him. Up to and including the point where he leaves the party and dies. However, the developers went out of their way to ensure that there are many ways to resurrect him very nearby where he dies. Oh, and by the way, this is a setting where resurrection is cheap. That's actually a plot point. It's one of the fundamental underpinnings of the setting, that it's actually easy, both by magic and by technology, in fact by multiple types of technology, to bring someone back from the dead. And when you bring Virgil back, he gives this absolutely amazing speech, which is also very, very relevant for the endgame, and is horrific foreshadowing in another way. And I strongly recommend you go through with all of Virgil's stuff. Not only is it good stuff in its own right, but it really helps add to the endgame. I also want to talk about Magnus. I don't have much to say about Magnus other than the fact that he's awesome, but he is very much a Worf character. Now, I need to clarify that really quick, because it's a phrase I don't get to use that often. Most people, when they say a Worf character, they mean someone who's strong, who gets beaten up by the bad guy of the week to establish that the bad guy of the week is strong. That's not actually what I'm referring to. Worf is a Klingon raised by humans. He has the ideal of Klingon, and that is what he ascribes to. That's what he wants to be. The ideal Klingon, and he holds himself up to these concepts of honor and valor, and then he starts to, and as TNG and DS9 progress more and more, he gets more and more exposed to what Klingons are actually like, and surprise, surprise, they don't live up to the ideal. That's a dwarf character. Someone who is of a culture or organization or species who isn't raised in there and therefore only has his idea or her idealized version of that to live up to, and they try to. That's Magnus. Magnus has this idealized version of what a dwarf should be and tries to hold himself up to that ideal, and he's a city dwarf. Now, for those of you who don't quite understand the distinction, there's a world of difference between a regular dwarf, a clan dwarf, and a city dwarf. City dwarves are basically those who have effectively abandoned their clans, abandoned their traditions and pastimes, and decided to move forward with the Industrial Revolution. They're just people now. They're not dwarves. Their cultural identity is effectively gone. And it has been supplanted by the same melting pot cultural identity that everyone in the Industrial Revolution has. Gnomes, dwarves, humans, half-orcs, half-ogres, and I think there's another one. But you get the idea. Oh, by the way, half-ogres, all I gotta say is, what the hell? I know I didn't want to talk too much about the really horrific stuff in this setting, but good God. All I'm gonna say is eugenics, and just leave it at that. Moving on. So I like Magnus for that, but the best part is after all this, he tries so hard to live up to this ideal of a dwarf, and it takes some work to finally to peel through that and get to the point that he is in fact a city dwarf, that he doesn't actually have something. And then there's the twist later on where you find out he's actually, I wrote it down, he's from the Iron Clan. And he actually is a dwarf of some significance or renown back in the clan dwarves, and then he meets them and is like, oh, and that can go very well or very badly depending on what you do. As ever, it's kind of up to you how these events go. But I like Magnus. He was a great character. One of the things I like, I'm just going to start hitting some setting things really quick here, and then we're going to kind of move to the end game here. Just so give me a minute. I love that this is a setting in which the elves and the dwarves, many years ago, got along famously. Were basically stalwart allies. In fact, if it was not for the dark elves, there's a very good chance that the two would be allies to this day. Now, I mention that because, first of all, that's kind of a rarity, especially in a Tolkien-esque inspired situation, for elves and dwarves to be that close of friends and that close of allies. But this split happened because, on the surface, the split happened because the Black Iron Clan, or the Black Mountain Clan, the Black Mountain Clan had given away industrial technology to the humans, specifically, and as a consequence, the elves had insisted that that clan be banished, and that proved to be a very sticking point for both the dwarves and the elves. Oh, by the way, when I say banished, I mean banished into the fricking void. We'll be talking about the void, don't worry, I'm saving that one for later. So, that's the surface level. Let's dig a little bit deeper. So there's this gnome. Now, gnomes are kind of horrific in this setting. I'm going to diverge just for a second to talk about this, because I compared this on stream. I compared many of the gnomes to the railroad barons here in the United States many, many years ago. I bring that comparison specifically because for all that we talk here in the modern era about corporations being evil and corrupt, they're nothing compared to what the railroad barons were like. I mean, this is kiddie pool stuff compared to what the railroad barons were doing back in the day. It was messed. And I'm not going to discuss details because, to be blunt, I don't want to. I don't even want to think about it. I keep that in the back of my mind as a comparison point to remind myself that however bad things are gotten now, they're nothing compared to how bad they've been. And I use railroad barons because I happen to live in the United States. But, sadly, pretty much every geopolitical area in the world has someone like the railroad barons. Banana plantations was one that was brought up on the stream, for example. Wherever you live, there was, I almost guarantee there was some group in the past, in decades or centuries ago, which was just absolutely way beyond tolerance, way beyond acceptability, way beyond morals, way beyond ethics, just absolutely black abuse of power. You know what I mean? Just no gray, no, we were doing it from, no, just full on evil. That's the gnomes. Not as a whole species. There's actually plenty of pretty decent gnomes, but the gnomes who are running the joint. In fact, the gnomes basically run society when the game starts. Now, thanks to your efforts, you can either solidify their control, destroy their control and leave it in kind of chaos, or usurp their control and let people who actually have a freaking brain and a sense of ethics and morals in charge as well. There's this great tidbit. There's this whole great quest line where you can help a half-orc. Or is it an orc? I think he's actually an orc, sorry. An orc, who are very much in the typical we are the hated cultural group slot. Use whatever real-life parallel you'd like to. They're all basically the same when it comes down to we hate you because you're less than us mentality. You know, it's fantastic racism kind of thing. You can help an orc prove, you know, how intelligent and how capable he is, and he can actually rise up within the ranks, take over the council, you know, that kind of thing. It's a great little side quest. But the gnomes in general have this absolute monopoly on things. And I mention that because it's something that kind of makes sense to me. That a certain group of people would just basically be like, yeah, we're just going to become the railroad barons and use that power to take over. And it also makes sense to me that that power would be disrupted by someone of significant personal power in a fantasy setting, which, hey, we happen to be. Anyways, so there's this gnome, continuing with my thought previously. Gilbert Bates. Gil Bates, who is this very wealthy gnome who got famous for inventing this great new technology that he actually stole from someone else. Although, obviously, that was kind of done as a tongue-in-cheek thing. Although he does have a rival who's basically a horrible bastard called Appleby. Anyways, parodies aside, for there are many in this game. Although nowhere near as much as Fallout 2. This game had a much more serious and dark tone than Fallout 2. But anyways, so, which is funny because I liked it more. That says something about me. Gilbert Bates so what actually happened was Gilbert Bates used his connections with the dwarves and, without their permission, released all these inventions unto humanity as if they were his own, which therefore led to all that technology becoming widespread in humanity. You know, the Industrial Revolution, steam power, and all that kind of stuff, right? Now, the dwarves had access to this tech for a while. We're talking a long while. They've known about this stuff for forever. But there's a recurrent thread that the races that live longer, elves and dwarves both live into the 600-year range on average, don't really like to be progressive. They are very stagnant, but they view that as the correct path. There's actually a quote here, which I wrote down. Where is it? I know I wrote it down somewhere. There it is. A human will look at a problem and say, can we do this? A dwarf will say, what is the cost of doing this? It's an inaccurate quote, I just realized, because I only put notes there. But that's the gist of the quote. The dwarves and the elves believe that they are wiser than the humans, and therefore that's why they are not progressive. The humans, of course, live shorter lives, and it is theorized, but not absolutely stated, I might add, that the humans have been pushing this massive industrial revolution because they have shorter lives, and therefore do not have to live to see the consequences of their actions. Now, the funny thing here is, the game kind of leaves it up to you, as ever, to decide which side is right here. Should the more stagnant approach to things be taken? Should we take our time and our effort and really decide if we're going to do something? Or should we push for more progressive change, regardless of the fact that that change is going to be very chaotic and altering? But I digress. So, with that done, a certain group of elves, known as the Dark Elves, who are elf supremacists, in other words, elves are superior to everyone else, who were operating under what they believed were orders from one of their ancient leaders, Aranax, I'll get to that in a minute, just moved forward and said, no, and politicked their way, manipulated their way into saying we need to have those specific dwarves banished for their horrible crimes. And then the Dwarf King, who wasn't really thinking about it properly, Logair, was like, okay, fine, I will capitulate. And in his shame decided to himself go into self-imposed banishment, which also led to a decline of Dwarven society in general. All of this was actually, even that's actually only the second layer of things, because the third layer of things has to do with Kurgan. All I'm going to say is that Kurgan was behind all of that, and move on. That's the third layer, and the final layer. If you even know who Kurgan is at this point in time, bravo. I know some people who've played this game who don't. So, but one of the things I love most, so that caused this great division between the elves and the dwarves, and what I love about that is that you can talk to several NPCs on both sides, dwarves and elves, and they will both say what amounts to the same thing. Well, it's no wonder we don't get along. Our cultures are so different. It's just a fundamental difference of philosophy, and yet that's absolutely not true. They have the same cultures in almost every respect. They have the same general philosophies, the same general mindsets. It's actually probably why they were such good allies and friends back before that division happened. I like to think that after that comes to light in post-game, that the elves and the dwarves mend fences and become the allies that they were used to be, because that actually makes sense for me, and I kind of worked for a golden ending in this one. There are... Okay. So I mentioned the humans thing, and the cost thing, the short lives. The game puts a lot of effort in focusing on just how terrible the Industrial Revolution has. The Victorian era and all of the bad aspects of the Victorian era. The game goes way out of its way to emphasize the dirty, underhanded, slaving, murdering, disgusting pollution, abuse, just all of the horrible stuff that happens as a result of the Industrial Revolution. It really focuses on that. And if I'm being honest, I think this is actually one of the weaker points of the game's narrative, because it focuses on that so hard and basically never really analyzes any of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. It never actually tries to look at anything positive happening, to the point where one can be easily stated as saying that there is nothing positive happening as a result of the Industrial Revolution, that things are just bad and getting worse, and therefore, maybe we should just go ahead and stop and go back with the Elven Dwarven way. But there is one thing they do, and I feel like this was going to be something that they wanted to do more with, because again, there was that Journey to the Center of Arcanum game they were going to work on. If you really pay attention to all the books and all the ancient lore, and you talk to all the elves and all the dwarves, you find out that forever ago there was this massive event, which we'll call the Conjunction of Spheres. No. Where magic was just... and there was just an absolutely huge amount of magic in the world. And the impression is that magic waxes and wanes. So if this is the bar, and this is technology, and this is magic, that the world does this. Right? Here's the thing. One of the things the game does very cleverly and very accurately is it has people say things as if they were fact when they're just presumption or guesses. It would be kind of like someone in real life saying, well, obviously you have a fever, so we need to cut your arm a bit to let the heat out. As if that was demonstrable fact. So, I'm pretty sure that's actually wrong, because there's a lot of other hints that what actually happened is all that magic flooded into the world, created most of the magically imbued races, created the magical creatures, and of course led to the invention of and the discovery of magic, and the mutation of the elves, all that fun stuff. Oh, by the way, there is an in-lore explanation for why humans and elves and orcs are all compatible. It's because they're all basically the same race, or at least they were, but I digress. So, that happened, and then the magic has basically been doing this ever since. Basically seeping back out of the world at a very slow rate, but nonetheless existent. The implication there is that eventually magic will be gone. That eventually there just will be no more magic in Arcanum, and it will just be technology left over. And at that point, the Industrial Revolution looks a lot better, don't it? If you think about it. Although this kind of goes back to that whole agrarian versus society thing I brought it back in Fallout 2. But I digress. I want to talk about one other thing really quick, because that reminds me of something else. One of the things I love about this is it strikes a very specific balance. One of the questions I get most often in settings, and it actually irritates me sometimes, just not the question itself, but the frequency with which it's brought up kind of irritates me. Why are you using swords when you have access to guns? I'm sure you've heard of that question before. You may have even asked that question before. Sometimes a setting goes out of its way to explain that. Warcraft, for example, as much as I hate to use that, but it came up like 20 times during the lore run. Warcraft goes out of its way to explain that a magically imbued sword is therefore pretty much going to universally outperform a gun, which can jam, has loading issues, all the problems of early guns had. And of course, a sword is generally easier to craft and cheaper, right? This game analyzes that same thing, but it does it from both directions. Guns exist. That machine guns exist, for God's sakes. And yet most of the guards and troops and general people who fight use, axes and swords and whatnot. Why? Well, an axe is like 3 gold. A gun is closer to 30. Also, a gun can jam, and a gun needs ammo. Think about it. Now so that's the first angle they take with that. Obviously, people still use melee weapons and whatnot because they're cheaper and they're easier to procure. However, they do something very clever, and I like this. Magic is stronger than tech. This is true in gameplay. I already talked about that. But I mean, even in lore, a mage is stronger than a guy with a gun, like 10 times out of 10, of equivalent power, right? Thing is, being a mage requires taking lots of time and effort and personally investing yourself into studying your art and mastering it and applying yourself and spending years of focus in order to become stronger and stronger in this mage craft, right? Using a gun requires being able to point and shoot. Do you see the difference now? There's this wonderful tidbit where the well-trained, well-armed, well-experienced Caledon, I think, army went up against a bunch of peasants with guns. Guess who won? And the reason they won was because anybody can use a gun. I mean, your shot may be bad, but anybody can use a gun. And that makes that difference so much more powerful, because all of a sudden, and this just kind of clicked with me, one of the things I talk most in my discussions about fictional works, because this only applies in fiction because it doesn't exist in real life, is the difference between personal power and political power, and how the two interact with each other. In this case, magic is personal power. You becoming more personally powerful, and technology is political power, because you gain more power if you bother to study this magic, and you will be able to force your will upon others. But a baron, or a duke, or a king, or a council member, or a corporate leader, they, with their money and their political connections, can get a large number of guns, or bombs, or flasks, or whatever, and use that to empower a bunch of peasants, or a bunch of thugs, to be stronger than you, basically. And the dynamic between this tech and magic and the political versus personal power is everywhere in this game. That leads me to my next 2 things I want to talk about. So, it is worth noting that, as I mentioned earlier, magic and tech don't mix. The stated reason for that is that technology requires physics to work, and magic requires physics to not work. And so the two don't really work out that well. And stronger magic will outdo weaker tech, and stronger tech will outdo weaker magic. One of my favorite examples of this is there's actually a train crash. A train basically stops working, crashes into a thing, lots of people get hurt and killed. And the suspicion everyone has is, well, a mage did it. Someone was casting spells nearby, and that caused the train to disrupt, right? Although, of course, that would have to be a pretty strong mage. By the way, I just want to share this really quick. This is hilarious to me. If you try to get on a train, you go through this whole, are you a mage? Have you ever been a mage? Will you ever be a mage thing? They actually have a mage detector. It's a stopwatch. That's it. It's just a stopwatch. But the hands will go backwards if they're by magic, because simply being a mage and having that power within you will disrupt physics around you and make the physics-relying thing. You get it. But here's the really interesting thing about this. Can you see my armchair? Yeah, you kind of can. Here's the really interesting thing about this. The technology is basically magic in this setting. No, I'm serious. It's actually science is what it literally is. It's straight out of the 50s and 60s, where you can just have a robot that you push buttons and it makes the world spin backwards. It doesn't actually have to make any kind of sense. There are elixirs and potions and machines that can bring people back from the dead and turn lead into gold and just all sorts of other things like that. It is science in its most fundamental form. I mention that, first of all, because it amuses me, but second of all, because it ties into my next point. There's a lot of evidence, especially in the Vendigroth, which I keep saying wrong. It's actually not Vendrigoth, it's Vendigroth, and I'm sorry, I've said it wrong for years. I'm working on it. Vendigroth. There is a fair amount of evidence with the Vendigroth and a few other things that magic and tech actually can coexist just fine. The idea, although it's never really discussed, is that you need to find the balance point. You need to find some way to basically allow for magic and tech to coexist just right. And funnily enough, that's actually kind of how the Vendigroth device itself works, in a way. Of course, obviously that requires the healing shell thing. But also, that was kind of Kurgan's plan to begin with, was to abuse that particular conjunction thing to leave the void, right? It's also how What's-His-Face left. But I digress. Point being, I have a theory about the void. Now let's talk about the void really quick. Because the void is another dimension where they discovered the ability to banish people to. Now that was a significant discovery for the cultures of the people of Arcanum, because it was so easy to raise the dead. It was so easy to raise the dead that it was actually kind of it was a commonplace thing. It was normal. And permanently dealing with someone was very, very difficult. It's one of the reasons why the Vendigroth device was so terrifying in its own right. Permanently killing someone, that required extra effort. And the void was the perfect solution to that, because you can't be resurrected from the void. You're not dead. You're just there. And there's no leaving the void except under really specific circumstances. Now, when they did this, they thought there was no escape from the void. There is escape, but it's not easy to accomplish. It requires a lot. In fact, I think a grand total of 3 people do escape from the void over the course of the game, depending on your actions, and a 4th might have, depending on your actions. So, yeah, not an easy thing to accomplish, right? While you're there, you don't age, and your memories basically stay as they are. It's described more than once that even though, a bajillion years could have passed, it doesn't feel like a bajillion years. It feels like yesterday. Like you could have been tossed in there 3 millennia ago, and it feels like it was yesterday, because of the way you're just getting this kind of weird sort of temporal stasis. I've been thinking about that for a while, and I've come up with a theory on what exactly the void is. I think the void is the source of magic. I think the void is where all that magical, supernatural energy came from and accidentally burst into the world of Arcanum. Or maybe it was deliberate. You never know. But something happened to cause all that magical energy to burst into Arcanum, disrupting the otherwise more mundane world of Arcanum. Call it a 5th-dimensional entrance kind of event. And, I just realized most of you won't even know what I mean by that. And, so all of a sudden, the fantastical was available in Arcanum, and it is my opinion that that also fundamentally changed how physics works in Arcanum. And that's actually why science is science instead of actual science. Because it's operating on a function of physics that don't work the same. This would also explain the nature of life in the void. The idea here is that what Kurgan has uncovered with regards to the Dead Sea, the Silvery Sea in the void, is not the true nature of life, it's the true nature of magical life. To be in this eternal stasis, to think of 1,000 years ago as if it was yesterday, and to be at peace, to be calm, to have the introspective and the mentalities of it, right? And of course, if you're actually dead, then you stay there and you just live the rest of your days within the Silver Sea. I mention that because I think that explains basically everything about what happens with regards to the 3 principal characters, which I am now finally going to discuss. The Nasruddin is I actually don't have a lot to say about Nasrudin, if I'm being completely blunt. But what I like about Nasrudin is the fact that he is someone who, despite being massively powerful, does not like that fact. He, in fact, is really irritated that an entire religion has sprung up around him. And then, so he leaves and goes to this island where an entirely new religion springs up around him. Oh my god, really? But I think Nasrudin is a great example of the contrast between how the dwarves and how the Kintarans both reproach the coming change of Arcanum. Excuse me. The Kintarans, just like Nasrudin, decided to just seal themselves off. Screw this. Nope. Dug their heels in and said, we ain't changing. It's exactly what Nasrudin does. He gives up. He runs away. He doesn't try to do anything. It's not until you show up that he finally gets galvanized to actually attempt something. The dwarves, by contrast, they decide to just acclimate. That's why city dwarves exist, right? And we see this contrast between them and, well, Aranax. I know this is a weird comparison, but bear with me, because Aranax is the... I guess I should discuss Aranax briefly. He was an immeasurably powerful, probably one of the most powerful mages that this history has seen. Mage, elf. And he was a hot-headed idiot who was constantly power-hungry and constantly pushing for stuff, and did some pretty horrible things, including wiping out a country pretty much by himself. That would be the Vendigroth, which hopefully I'm starting to say correctly. Aranax has acclimated and adapted. He was tossed into the void, imprisoned by Kurgan, and spent that time actually having real remorse, really regretting. Even if you flat out mention, even if you bring up the excuse of his father, he takes the blame on his actions upon himself. He can actually join your party, too. And if you let him out, he actually goes back and tries to rebuild Vendigroth and try to make up for what he's done. Nice little touch. But all of that leads to Kurgan. Before I go any further, one of the things I want to mention is the two overarching themes of this work. Now, I've been bringing up the first theme many times. It's actually said flat out, I believe, by Nasrudin, but the quote is roughly, don't have blind faith in anything. In other words, don't take things at surface value. Don't look at simple facts. Try to analyze complex facts instead. This is everywhere in the game, even in little mini-quests. Loghaire, I mentioned him. The ring from the gnome is a great example of that. It's like, here, take this MacGuffin. This will lead you to victory. It's actually irrelevant. It's not a MacGuffin. It's just a frickin' ring. It's just there to help you identify who you're looking for, which, by the way, is Gilbert Bates himself. Funny little fact. The whole situation with the Panari, another excellent example of surface value versus complex facts. Think about it. It's a non-stop theme, and the idea is that you shouldn't take anything just for granted, that you should actually make up your own mind and divest through it. I mention that because that's how you can talk your way around Kurgan. He is convinced of his mentality, and yet he himself gives away that he hasn't had anyone discuss this with, and that he wants to. He wants to discuss his philosophy. He wants to discuss this with someone else of intellect and capacity. And you can talk him into the fact that his own perspectives and experiences are flawed and are looking at the situation from a unilateral perspective instead of a multilateral perspective. And that is what eventually convinces him that he is in fact wrong. Now, what's funny about that, Kurgan started off as a well-meaning but curious mage. He then turned into a power-hungry maniac. He then turned into something different. I like Kurgan because though he is obviously a villain, he's not... I have a very hard time ascribing him as evil, because for me evil is about intent, not about action. His goal is to kill all life. Now that sounds pretty evil, but it's because he's actually been to the Dead Sea, which is where the dead go after they die. And it's basically paradise. It is effectively paradise. And it is described in every way as paradise. And in fact, if you have Virgil with you, who has died and come back, when you talk with Kurgan, Virgil confirms this. Yeah. No. It's amazing. It is a wondrous place, and I want to go back to that incredible peace. And the funny thing is, he describes it as freedom. Not being contained within this sea, but as being free in all directions. He wants to bring this paradise to all life, to end suffering and to end pain, and to end torment. Now, this brings me to the second theme of the work. This is a more subtle theme, because it doesn't show up in like virtually every quest like the previous theme does, but it is an undercurrent throughout the entire work. And that undercurrent is that it's about choice. This may sound funny because Pillars of Eternity has an extremely similar theme. I mentioned earlier the possibility of connection between the two. The undercurrent theme is that it may or may not hurt to do something. It may or may not cost to do something. It may or may not be difficult to do something. But it is up to you to use the freedom of choice to decide if that is worth doing for you. And I phrase that very specifically because there's no right or wrong in that statement. There's no, you must strive forward because life is worth living. No, 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 no. You decide if you must strive forward and if what you will accomplish with that, you might accomplish with that, is worth the effort or worth the pain. That's up to you. It's all about choice. And that ultimately is why, even though Kurgan is a fairly well-meaning individual, he is flawed in his reasoning, because he is presuming that choice for everyone else. What I find fascinating about this is I guarantee you, if Kurgan basically just opened up a shop or whatever, just bear with me, on Arcanum and said, I offer anybody who wishes a peaceful transition into the afterlife. And he wouldn't even have to sell it because he wants to do this. He's giving this away for free, right? I bet you a fair number of people would take him up on that offer by choice, because for them, they have chosen that it is not worth it to keep going, that it is not worth continuing to endure pain or hardship or discomfort or effort. They languish. They don't want to see tomorrow, so they would accept his deal. Think about that for a minute. It's one of the wonderful things that adds a layer of shading to Kurgan, because he's well-meaning and an extremist, but he's also flawed and still has tints of a villain, and yet it still has character on top of that. Layers. And it's funny because we really only encounter Kurgan once. I mean, we actually encounter him a couple times, and funny fact, earlier on when he shows up to you posing as Aranax, if you look at him through the UI, you can tell he's human, which kind of gives away that it's not Aranax. But anyways, we only encounter him a few brief periods of time, but he's a very memorable villain for me because of these layers that are added to him. And because of the fact that, of course, you can spend like 10 freaking minutes just talking to him right at the end of the game. Or you could just kill him. I mean, that's possible too. Just say, die. That is, that's actually all I have to say, basically. I'm just checking my notes really quick here. Yeah, I guess that's it. Great game. Loved going through it again. Hope to see you guys next week, where we'll be looking at Planescape Torment, or Torment Planescape, or Torment of the Planescape, Torment-y, Planescape-y. I never remember what to call it. The old one. See you around, guys.